Okay, so now that we've looked at spectrograms, I want to just touch on some echolocation basics, just so you kind of understand what's actually happening in the environment when we are recording these spectrograms. So as I said this morning, bats echolocate by producing pulses of sound. So now we know that those pulses of sound are called a call or a pulse. And these pulses are separated by periods of quiet, during which the bat is listening for the echoes that allow it to form a mental map of its surroundings. So now we also know those periods of quiet are your TBC, your time between calls. So that TBC is to allow bats to listen for the echoes. Bats are able to produce both high and low frequency calls. The low frequency calls that humans are capable of hearing are often social calls. So some of you have been out bat trapping before, and you know what it sounds like when the bats are chatting to each other. We can actually hear that. So those would be considered social calls. The high frequency calls that are out of the range of our hearing may also sometimes be social calls, but are more often echolocation calls. So they may actually be emitting social calls that we can't hear, but the calls we are looking at today are mainly echolocation calls. So echolocation calls are predominantly used for navigation and foraging. Those would be the purposes. And depending on the habitat that is being sampled, it may be more common to get foraging calls. So if you put your detector out at a wetland habitat, like you already touched on this morning, a good foraging habitat maybe for little brown myotis, you're probably more likely that you're recording bats while they're foraging. If you put a detector out in a forested corridor, like a commuting corridor, then those echolocation calls may be navigation calls. And that actually doesn't matter when looking at files. I'm not going to look at a file and go, oh, it's, navigating or it's foraging. That's just more just for your own knowledge and background. A significant amount of information can be determined from a spectrogram of bat calls. So the calls will have distinctive characteristics of appearance based on the species, the habitat in which the call is made, and the purpose of the call, so bat behavior. So it's really important to examine a spectrogram carefully to give the spectrogram the proper interpretation. So for bat species ID, we're really looking for echolocation calls. And more specifically, the search phase of the echolocation sequence, which I will touch on in like 2 slides, I think. Okay, so as I just mentioned, bats typically use echolocation calls when flying to help them create an image of their surroundings because they're moving in darkness and they can't really see. So there is some indication that bats receive information from other bats through echolocation calls, but bats are primarily communicating through social calls. So the social calls are not necessary to create a mental map of their surroundings, and so they function very differently from echolocation calls. So the purpose of a social call and echolocation call are very different, and so the calls actually look quite different. And this would be an example of social call here that you can look at. So social calls, like I said, can be lower in frequency, and we can actually hear some of the calls, which sound kind of like a chittering noise. I'm not going to do it for you, but you can always look it up over lunch if you want to hear what it sounds like. So that when we record social calls on a spectrogram, they may kind of resemble echolocation calls, and you'll see later today, especially if you're looking in normal time view, it might look normal, like a bat echolocation call. But then when you zoom in like here in compressed time view, the calls may be uncharacteristic in some ways. So maybe the frequency is lower than you would expect, or maybe the calls jump around in an unusual way, which we see here. So typically when we're looking at bat echolocation calls, it's moving from higher to low frequency, or it could be flat, but you're basically looking for like smooth lines. You don't want to see any lines that I consider like wormy or wavy. So you don't want to see lines that are like wiggling, like going up and down, like this line in the middle where it curves up in the middle. You don't really want to be seeing that. If you have any pulses with a negative slope, that's always an indication something weird is happening. Sometimes if you just record poor quality pulses, the slope will be artificially negative, but it's something to keep an eye out for when you're looking at pulses. So it may be possible to look at these and say that they're social calls, but it is often difficult to properly identify them because they do not follow the typical echolocation patterns we use to identify bat calls to species. So while I may look at this and I think that it does look like a social call sequence, I actually can't ID this to species because we don't know enough about the social call patterns of bats, essentially. So if the social call sequence can be confidently identified to a bat, so if I look at this and I listen to it, you can play back the sound in the Kaleidoscope software, and I look, and I'm just using those two methods. If I can look at this and say, oh, well, this is a bat, but I can't ID it to species, I can identify this file as no ID, which means that it is a bat, but I can't identify it to any species or species groups, so you go with no ID. Or if I look at this and I'm like, something weird is going on, I have no idea what this is, then you could identify this file as noise as well and just screen it out completely. Does that make sense for social calls? And this is something you may see if you are actually doing a stationary point survey with an emergence survey, because the bats talk a lot before they leave the roost. Good? Okay. So now I want to get into actually echolocation, which is what we are more concerned about than social calls. So there are 3 typical phases that you might observe in a bat echolocation sequence: the search phase, the approach phase, and the terminal phase, which we often just call the buzz. So these 3 phases tend to follow the same general order. So it always goes search, approach, terminal, and they always follow that sequence, but they may not always be entirely sequential depending on the success of the bat. So like you can see here, it goes search, approach, and then you expect buzz, right? But it actually goes back to search. And that's because the approach, for whatever reason, was unsuccessful. And so the bat will then return to the search phase. So it always follows the same order, but if a certain phase is unsuccessful, the bat may return to the previous phase before starting the sequence again. If the 3 sequences successfully reach their conclusion, the bat may start over again in the first phase. So here we have search, approach, buzz. So that was successful. If we recorded past this, it's likely going to go back to search, approach, and maybe a buzz again. Okay, so it's always following that pattern of search, approach, buzz. The bat calls often look considerably different depending on the phase. So the search phase is when the bat is flying around, sending out echolocation calls to navigate its surroundings or to search for prey. That's why we call it search. It's searching, essentially. Makes sense. These calls are fairly consistent and evenly spaced, and so this is the phase we use when identifying bat calls to species. Please use the search phase when identifying bat calls to species. So you can see here the calls are spaced further apart. Yeah, so they're spaced fairly evenly, fairly regularly. And when we actually zoom in on this and compress time, you can see the shape of the calls as well. In the approach phase, that happens when a bat has detected echoes reflecting off of an object and it responds to the object, which may be a surface. So it may be like the ground, it could be a tree, it could be another bat, or it could be prey. So the bat wants to approach this object, the approach phase, it wants to approach this object to verify whether or not it is something it is interested in. Is this object something it wants to eat? Is it maybe a water source it wants to drink from? It's not sure, but it's interested, and so it wants to approach and see. These calls are spaced more closely together, so the calls will have a shorter TVC, so they have a shorter time between calls. So you can see that here, the calls become closer together. So again, we'll see this when looking in normal time view. The calls often have a steeper slope and a faster change in frequency, and they sweep through a greater range in frequency, which we're not necessarily seeing here, although the calls do have a very steep slope here. But we may also be losing some of those upper frequencies. So the approach phase calls may also vary in frequency, often tending towards higher frequencies, which allows for better object resolution and distance calculations. So essentially the bat is trying to get a lot more information a lot quicker because it wants to know if this thing that it's detected is something it is interested in. So that's why you have calls that are spaced together a lot more closely, and you're sometimes having greater change in frequency because you're trying to get more information. The terminal phase, or the buzz, which we see here on the end in yellow, this is made when the bat is sufficiently close to the object of interest and it has determined that it is prey, it will attempt to eat, or water, it will attempt to drink. So it's decided now that this is something it definitely wants to pursue, essentially. These calls become extremely close together. We actually can't separate out the individual pulses here. This little green blur, or kind of like buzz, it's made of distinct pulses like we see here. They're just insanely close together. Like that's 0.2 seconds, this little section in here. And look at how many pulses would be within that. So these calls often also increase in frequency, and they have a very steep slope as well. Often we don't even record the terminal phase because it may be of lower amplitude, given that the bat may be very close to its target at this point in time. So that's why we often only record the buzz in full spectrum, because remember, zero cross is only recording sounds of the highest amplitude. So the buzz is often not of high enough amplitude to be recorded in zero cross. So here we're only seeing it in full spectrum. And the bat will decrease the amplitude because it's very close to the object that it's approaching. So it doesn't want to scream too loudly. So it doesn't want to emit calls of really high amplitude that will then be reflected back really loudly in its face. And it creates this confusion or noise. So it's decreasing in amplitude as it's getting closer to the object. Or the bat actually may stop echolocating entirely right before it captures its prey. It doesn't want to alert its prey to its presence. And so it may not even emit this feeding buzz or this buzz at all. Okay, so that was like a lot of information, but all you really need to know from this slide is to focus on the search phase. Any questions on that? No? Okay. And again,
there is a little confusion. So are we recording the sound of the bat's movement or the sound that the bats are making?
The sound that the bats are making, but the bat's movement affects the sound that it's making, essentially. So I guess, is it the names that are confusing them? Because it's like search approach. So those are in reference to movement, but it's just because the bat is changing how it's echolocating based on its movement. So when it's flying around searching in the environment and it hasn't honed in on something it's interesting in, its calls will reflect that. So actually the echolocation calls do match the bat's movement, but we are focusing here on the echolocation calls the bats are emitting.
So, and there's a follow-up, and I think it's not completely clear yet. So not a sound coming out of their mouths?
Nope, the sound coming out of their mouths. Yeah.
Yeah. So bats basically constantly are doing within an inaudible spectrum. They're going.
Here, sorry, give me a second. I am going to go back to a picture. Okay, so this is what we're recording. You can pretend that each line that the bat is emitting, so that's the bat emitting pulses of sound. It's like, think of it as little clicks. And so these spaces between the lines are where the bat is listening for these purple lines coming back. So the bat's not emitting the purple lines, that's the yellow lines come out, they hit an object like a moth, and then they reflect back to the bat, and the bat is listening for those sounds coming back to it. And so it's constantly doing this because it can't see, and so it's constantly emitting like clicks into the environment that it's always waiting to hear the click return to it. And because it can kind of tell, how far the calls go out and then come back, it can create this idea or this mental map of its surroundings. And it can know, oh, there's an object that's I know it's not thinking exactly like this, but there's an object that's 3 meters away. There's something that's 5 meters away, and it can kind of form a map of its surroundings. So when a bat is flying, you'll actually see in photos, its mouth is open usually. And that's because it's almost always, not always, I don't know if you covered it this morning, but bats are not always echolocating when flying, depending on their surroundings, but often they are. And so when they're flying, you see their mouth open and we can't hear it, but they're literally screaming, making these like really loud, like click sounds. So each of these lines here that it's sending out would be one of those like clicks, and each of those are a line on the spectrogram.
As Jolene says in the chat, it is similar to whales and dolphins who use echolocation as well. So yeah, literally using your voice to make these clicking sounds all the time. Yeah.
It's like a form of sonar, which it actually says sonar here, but
it's interesting though, Gail, where you were asking about, is it their wings? This is kind of going off on a side note, but
we don't have time for side notes.
It seems bats are using the movement of their wings to help their I guess airways, their vocal cords, to create that sound.
I thought he was going to go on a detailed tangent.
But it's their voice, yeah.
Okay, I hope that's more clear. But yeah, so I do want you to kind of think of what you're actually, what are these lines of sound? So each of those would be one of those that the bat is sending out into its environment. And the black space between each of those is where it's listening for the sound to come back, essentially. And it's kind of hard to understand because it's so rapid. Like we have no, like this whole file is like less than 6 seconds. Like it's just so fast that it's, I think, hard to understand sometimes. Okay. Any other questions on, I think that's pretty clear. Yeah. So obviously when it's searching, the calls are spaced more far apart because it's not necessarily honed in on an object. And as it approaches an object, it emits those calls a lot closer together to get more information back really fast, essentially. And then the buzz really demonstrates that. Yeah. Okay. I also want to touch on how habitat can affect bat echolocation calls. So the type of habitat a bat is flying in can affect the shape of their calls in a variety of ways. So the first habitat consideration is the degree of clutter present. So when Jordi was talking about clutter with a microphone this morning, he was talking about clutter being in the way of the microphone so that when you're recording a bat, the bat call goes through the clutter and it affects the call quality, right? So he was talking about clutter in reference to the microphone. Now, when I'm talking about clutter, because clutter is the same thing, I'm talking about clutter from the bat's perspective. So depending on how the level of clutter in the environment to the bat, not the microphone, to the bat itself while it's flying, it's going to change its echolocation calls. So we categorize clutter as high, moderate, or low. So clutter is simply the amount of material in the environment that can reflect back an echolocation call. So for a bat, when it's flying, its clutter is something that its call is going to now bounce off of and reflect back to it. In terms of the microphone, that would prevent us from recording the call, right? Because the sound bounces off of the clutter and it doesn't ever reach the microphone. But now we're just talking about it from the bat's perspective. So for an example, a high clutter habitat would be a dense forest like you see here, where all of the leaves and branches and everything would be considered clutter. A low clutter habitat may be an open field where nothing is obstructing the flight or the echolocation calls of the bat. So when the bat's flying in this open field and it's sending out echolocation calls, there's nothing really for them to bounce back against. I mean, there is this tree line here. Let's pretend that's not there. But there's really nothing for the calls to reflect back against. And so we consider that low clutter from the bat's perspective. And then moderate clutter is a little harder to define, but it falls somewhere in between. So high clutter habitat will result in calls that generally have a steeper slope, a shorter duration, a higher frequency, and a greater change in frequency. So you don't have to memorize that, it's in our guide, but it's just to indicate that the calls will change their shape depending on the degree of clutter in the environment. In contrast, a low clutter habitat will result in calls with a lower slope, a longer duration, a lower frequency, and a smaller change in frequency. So it's typically easier to distinguish between bat species in low clutter habitat because there's more species variation in low clutter calls. So all of this is to say, when we're IDing the species and like every situation except one, we really want to be recording in as low clutter habitat as possible. Moderate can be okay, but we really don't want to be recording in high clutter because in high clutter, their calls are a lot steeper, they're closer together, and it's harder to actually distinguish between species because their calls all look very similar in high clutter, essentially. Does that make sense? Yes, okay. So this does make it challenging, of course, which I'll get into in the next slide for recording certain species. Is there a question in the chat?
No, I'm not seeing
Sorry.
any.
It must be an old thing that just lit up. Okay, so we can actually also categorize bats themselves, so bat species, depending on the type of habitat they are most likely to occupy. And then they share similar traits based on what kind of habitat they can be found in. So there are bat species found more frequently in high clutter habitats. And these species are often slower when flying. They emit calls that are closer together, so their calls have a shorter TVC. Their calls are often higher in frequency. Their calls will have lower amplitude. So we often call these high clutter bats whispering bats because their calls are very quiet, lower amplitude. Their calls will have shorter duration and a steeper slope. So bats predominantly found in high clutter habitat fly more slowly. I think this makes sense because they need to navigate through a landscape with a large number of obstacles. They can't fly super fast or they risk flying into a branch. So they fly slower so they can maneuver in a high clutter habitat. The characteristics of their calls relate to maximizing the information received from echolocating within a short time frame. So when they're echolocating, they need to get a lot of information really quickly. So basically before they run into something, before they collide with an object. So they need to get a lot of information very quickly, and that affects the shape of their echolocation calls, which is like you think of the approach phase is similar, right? They're trying to get more information quickly, and that changes the shape of their echolocation calls. Their calls are lower in amplitude because the bats are echolocating close to the objects in the environment. And by lowering the amplitude, it reduces the confusion that comes from excessive reflecting off of these objects. So again, that's also a bit like the feeding buzz, right? So the bats are very close to these objects in high clutter environment. And so instead of screaming at the object and having all this noise reflect back at them, they're going to echolocate a lot quieter. And that's why we call them whispering bats. The northern myotis is an example of a species that predominantly occupies high clutter. So the northern myotis is a whispering bat. So this makes it hard to record this species acoustically because its calls are lower in amplitude. So the bat would have to be a lot closer to the microphone to actually record it. And also because it's often found in high clutter, it's a high clutter bat species. Remember, we really want to be relying on low clutter calls for species ID, not high clutter calls. And so it also makes it almost impossible to identify this species in high clutter where it is found. So northern myotis is very difficult to target acoustically. In contrast, bat species more frequently found in low clutter habitats are fast flyers and not as maneuverable. So they're in a large open environment. They can fly really fast without fear of running into something, essentially. These species emit calls that are spread further apart, so their calls have a longer TBC, and their calls will be lower in frequency, higher in amplitude, longer in duration, and lower slope. So their calls often look really flat. Again, you don't need to memorize all of those features. They're in the guide. So bat species found mainly in low clutter habitats are often faster flying, like I said, because they don't have to worry about running into objects. And these bats also use echolocation calls that are higher in amplitude. So their calls are a lot louder. We can think of it that way, because they have to compensate for the potentially long distance their calls may have to travel before reflecting off of an object. So if we go back to this field here, they have to have louder or high echolocation calls of higher amplitude because the sound may have to travel a lot further before it reaches that tree and comes back to them. So these species are more easily often picked up on detectors because the calls are of higher amplitude. So and so when you're thinking of your low clutter bat species, you're often thinking of your migratory bats, like the hoary bat, for example. Okay, does that make sense? So that's just some background to explain why different species may have very different looking echolocation calls. So I also want to touch on basically the effect of reflection. So how, again, habitat can affect what you're seeing in the spectrogram. And you already touched on this morning. So there are two types of reflections that can be recorded in addition to a bat pulse. So you have both specular and diffuse echoes. So your specular echoes, which we're touching on here, are those that are reflected off of a smooth surface, such as water or a rock. The specular echoes will appear on a spectrogram. It will look almost like a second back call that immediately follows the original back call. So we see that in this box here. We have the bat pulse that shows up in zero cross. And then we have the second pulse that immediately follows it, but it's only in full spectrum. And it matches the shape identically, like the curve and everything is exactly the same. Sometimes the echo will be a little bit shorter though, because we lose those upper frequencies. So this is a case where it's important to look at the file in both compressed and normal time view, because if you're looking compressed time view, you may think there's like a second bat in the background, even though it's only recorded in full spectrum. But then when you look in normal time view, it's actually hard to separate the echo from the pulse. It's this little green fuzzy bit right next to the pulse. They're almost touching. And so by looking at it, you can see it here as well, maybe a little more distinctly, that green blob right after the pulse. So looking at it in normal time, I can look at that and see that it's an echo. Our diffuse echoes are echoes that are reflected off of a rough surface, such as a tree. So rather than resembling the appearance of a second bat, the reflected sound is scattered and it appears as unspecific noise. So we see that here. Here's our pulse. This diffuse echo actually does show up in zero cross. Do you see the little dots in the middle? But it shows up as this unspecific noise. It's like this little blob of sound scattered. And then again, when we look at it in normal time, we can see that those pulses are touching, they match. It immediately follows it. Each of these pulses have a line immediately after it. And so by looking at that, we can tell that it is a kind of echo and it's not a second bat or anything like that. So this isn't like completely necessary for ID or anything. It's just when you're looking at files, you will start to see these things and it can help to be thinking, oh, like, what am I looking at? Is it an echo? What's going on? So in that vein, I also want to just very quickly touch on harmonics and echolocation. So harmonics are not a result of the environment. It's not due to sound reflecting off of something. The bat is actually producing the harmonics itself. It's able to echolocate at more than one frequency at the same time. So these are things that the bat is actually producing. It's not a result of the environment. Actually, some species are more prone to creating harmonics than others. So harmonics are sounds where the frequency changes by a certain number of steps. So an example of harmonics that you may be familiar with would be octaves in music, where each octave would be a different harmonic level. So we call the first harmonic the fundamental harmonic. So this bottom one here is the first harmonic. It's the harmonic with the lowest frequency, and it's usually also the harmonic of the highest amplitude. So that's why it records in zero cross, because it's high in amplitude. This harmonic up here is lower in amplitude, so it's only recording in full spectrum, not zero cross. So your upper harmonics will never be recorded in zero cross, only full spectrum. So the first harmonic here is at 25 kilohertz, and then the second harmonic is 2 times the frequency of the first harmonic. So it has to be spaced regularly like this. So you can see the first harmonic is 25, the second harmonic goes up to 50 kilohertz. If we had a third harmonic, it would be at 75 kilohertz. So it goes up in these very specific steps. Okay. So the harmonic with the highest amplitude is also called the dominant harmonic. So when you're looking at spectrograms, you're really just looking for this line that matches the pulses that is a set number of steps above, so basically double. And then when you look in normal time, the lines match up perfectly. It's right above. Oops, whoa, sorry. Got a little overexcited there. Does that make sense for harmonics? Yeah? So yeah, just some things you'll look for in files other than just looking for bat species. You might see harmonics, you might see your echoes in there as well. You could see social calls. That's something to look out for. And of course, you want to pay attention to what part of the echolocation sequence you're looking at. Any questions on any of that before we do a few, before we do an activity? No? Okay. We're going to do this activity and then we'll stop for lunch. What can change the appearance of a bat call? The species, the habitat, and the species, or bat behavior, the habitat, and the species?
See, I'm getting quite a few. Yeah.
Quite a few, right.
Lots of answers, great.
Right, so depending on the species, whether it's a high or low clutter species, depending on the habitat the bat's in, if it's in high or low clutter, and behavior. Is the bat approaching? Is it searching? What's it doing? That can all affect the appearance. Which is observable in this image? An echo, a social call, or harmonics?
Got a couple of A's. Yeah, lots of A's coming in now.
Yeah, that's right, A. So it's an echo. So we're looking for a line of sound following the bat call that basically matches it. And of course, it could be a little shorter, which it is here, but it matches the shape perfectly. Social calls, we're looking for those weird wiggly up and down lines, and harmonics, we're looking for a row of sound above, which we're not seeing here. Bonus question, what kind of echo is it? Is it diffuse or specular?
I've got 2, 3 speculars.
Awesome. Yeah. So of course you don't need to know this, like you don't need to memorize what a diffuse and specular echo is, but yes, this is specular. We can see it's specular because it's a smooth line following. And you can also think of it that a specular echo reflects off a smooth surface. So smooth, specular. Which is observable in this image? An echo, a social call, or harmonics? I'm just going to wait for a few more answers. Because a few people have done ID before. And
we've got mostly socials, but there's also one harmonic answer.
Cool. So actually, you're both right. I chose a bad example here. So my point was to show that this is a social call. And that's why it's important to look in compressed and normal time. Because when we're looking in normal time, this just looks kind of like a normal bat sequence. Like there is some noise below, but the pulses all look pretty normal to me. But then when we zoom in compressed time and we're seeing some of these curvy lines, I'm like, whoa, something weird is happening here. So this is an example of a social call. One person caught this though.
Two actually.
Oh, 2? Okay, there are, see, yeah, they're saying I see little harmonics. There are a few harmonics in here. You can see a little bit one, little tiny one here and here and here. So this is around, like 30 kilohertz, and you can see it jumps up to 60, so it doubles. That's how we know it's a harmonic. And then when we look at it in normal time, we're seeing them up here. I didn't mean to include this in this image. You already pointed it out to me, so. Good, you caught both. Which is observable in this image? An echo, a social call, or harmonics?
People are jumping to harmonics. Lots of folks are.
This is a better example of harmonics. You can see the line of pulses above. It matches perfectly, especially in normal time. It's directly lined up above. And this is like, I don't know, around 25 kilohertz and around 50 kilohertz. So it doubles again in frequency. And when I say that, I'm looking at the base of the call, like the bottom. Which phase of the echolocation sequence should be used for species ID? The terminal phase or the buzz, the search phase, or the approach phase?
B. Wow, people are super quick to answer.
Yeah, good. Excellent. Yeah, B, the search phase. I don't think I need to go into that anymore, but yeah. Okay, another little mini activity. I want you to decide whether the image in the photo represents low, moderate, or high clutter habitat. So there will be a mic in the photo because we want our mic to be pointing towards ideally low clutter habitat. So although I'm not talking about clutter around the mic, blocking the mic, I'm talking about the habitat in the direction the mic is pointing, and whether that habitat that the mic is pointing towards will be low, moderate, or high clutter in reference to the bat. Does that make sense, or did I explain that really poorly? No one's answering, so I might have explained that poorly. Oh, okay. It does make sense to at least 3 people. Okay. Because yeah, I know it can sometimes be confusing when we're talking about clutter about a microphone and then clutter about bats and then what's going on. So, okay. So here's your first image. So again, I'm not worried about clutter necessarily right around the mic. I'm more interested in if the habitat out here that the mic is pointing to is high, low, or moderate clutter in reference to the bat flying around in the environment. Everyone's already answered. Okay.
All low.
Oh, right. So there's definitely more than 3 meters, or is it, yeah, 3 meters between the microphone and this line of trees. It's quite open. There's not really any shrub or brush. I would consider this habitat low.
And so would a bat.
So would a bat, sorry. Yeah. How about this habitat? Again, we're not worried about the branches right around the mic, which is probably less than ideal.
Here we have some moderate, but also a moderate-ish, which I like.
I don't know what that is. Yeah, okay. Good. Nice. That's perfect for this one. I'm always impressed when we all agree on this one. I would also consider it moderate. It is or low. Someone said maybe low. So it's actually a wetland out here. when the bat's flying around, it's probably not flying, you know, among all the cattails and that kind of thing. So it's kind of lowish, but the cattails are pretty high. Because they go up so high off the ground, I would probably just consider this habitat moderate, kind of in the middle, like you all did. Does that make sense? Yeah, okay, cool. So yeah, low to moderate would be fine for that one. How about this one?
You got a bunch of highs.
Yeah, good. Yeah, I would also consider this high just because there are a lot of branches and needles and leaves in the environment. We don't know exactly what it looks like where the mic is pointing. Maybe it's this beautiful open like area within the woods. So maybe it could be moderate or a little lower, but we don't, but just looking at this image, it looks high. And I will point out this was a northern myotis study. And so they were trying to target high clutter habitat specifically, which is why they set up in a high clutter habitat. Although the mic ideally would be pointed a little more down. I always have to feel like I have to touch on that now.
Yeah.
Anyway, okay. How about this one?
Folks are saying hi for this one as well.
Yeah.
So not sure where it's pointing at, but looks high. Yeah.
It's pointing like here, but we can't really see beyond the edge of the photo. So that's just like, it's kind of a poor example because we photoshopped a mic into the image. But yeah, there's a lot of variation in this. I would maybe consider this high. If we're looking at the habitat behind in the photo, we can maybe assume that it looks like that in front of the mic, and in which case it would be high clutter. But maybe we're thinking that this is more of an open area in the woods in this direction, in which case it could be moderate as well. Likely not low in this environment, but it's hard to actually see exactly where the mic is pointing. And that's why when you're taking photos of your site, you should get your setup. So you should take a photo of this and you get the angle of your mic and everything, but you also should take a photo in the direction that the mic is pointing to as a reference for a species ID. How about this one?
People are saying low.
Awesome. Yeah, I would agree. There's a bit of shrub here. The mic really is meant to be pointing over the water, but we couldn't really do that. But yeah, it's pretty low in general anyway. Not a lot of clutter. It's fairly low to the ground.